Hello and welcome to the Triangle Regional Transit Program Alternatives Analysis Public Workshop Round 2 presentation. We appreciate you taking time with us today. The hope of this presentation is to give you the background information you need to make your experience on our website more meaningful and informative. Let's go ahead and get started and ask ourselves the question, well, what is the Triangle Regional Transit Program? Essentially, this is an effort to identify what transit will look like in Wake, Durham, and Orange County in the next 20 to 30 years. Some of the terms and expressions that you'll see on this website and in this presentation include buses, light rail, and commuter rail. Now a bus, I think everybody's had a chance to either ride a bus or at least see one, so I won't define that much further. But light rail is an electric-powered transit service, rail service. An example of one is found in Charlotte. They have a 9.6-mile light rail system there. Essentially, this is a more nimble technology. It can start and stop quicker. It can travel off the rail corridor and travel within the street. The station locations are generally 2/3 of a mile to a mile apart, as compared to commuter rail, for example, which is a more substantive form of rail that has a diesel-powered locomotive. It's generally found to travel between town to town or city to city. And as a result, the station locations are 2 to 3 miles apart. To give you some quick background on how we got here in the first place, 2 years ago, a group of citizens were pulled together called the Special Transit Advisory Commission. And their goal was to come up with a recommendation of what they thought transit should look like in Wake, Durham, and Orange County in the future. And so they spent a long year weighing all the various options, and when they were finished, they had a recommendation to move forward with. And our two metropolitan planning organizations adopted the vision or recommendation from the Special Transit Advisory Commission into their long-range transportation plan. And before I go any further, let me tell you what a metropolitan planning organization is, or an MPO. In the Triangle, we have two of them. There is Capital Area MPO, which represents Wake County, and DCHC, which stands for Durham, Chapel Hill, Carrboro MPO. And that represents Durham, Orange, and Chatham County. These two MPOs are comprised of elected officials and transportation experts whose target or focus is to identify all transportation projects for our region. So they look at roads, they look at bridges, they look at highways, and certainly they also deal with transit. Well, they took the vision and the recommendation of the Special Transit Advisory Commission and incorporated it into their long-range transportation plan. A big component of that plan, or of that vision, was based upon the concept that we had some new form of revenue to pay for mass transit improvements. And that's where that third bullet point comes in, where you see passage of North Carolina House Bill 148. Back in the summer of 2009, Governor Perdue signed into law what was called the Intermodal Bill. And essentially what this legislation does is it provides the opportunity for Wake, Durham, and Orange County to ask their citizens if they'd be willing to increase their sales tax by 1/2 cent to pay for mass transit improvements by way of referendum. I want to stop and make note that there are several different initiatives underway at this point, and I want to make sure that we're all clear about which process we're talking about. As you see the screen, if you look on the left-hand side, you'll see something called a mid-range bus plan. And that is essentially our MPOs, our county staff, and transit area providers are sitting down to look at what, if you had some new revenue, what new bus investments could we make? So should we increase frequency of existing services, or should we have some new services altogether? This is an ongoing study that's going on and being led by our counties and by our MPOs. And it's not the primary focus of today's presentation, but we want to make sure that you're aware that bus planning is ongoing presently. On the far right-hand side of the screen is what's called the Southeast High-Speed Rail System. And this, you may be aware, is that North Carolina received over $500 million to invest in a high-speed rail connection between Charlotte and Raleigh, with eventual hopes of connecting to Washington, D.C. Again, this is an initiative that's being pulled together by our Department of Transportation and is separate from what we're focused on again today, but also has a connection to the overall vision. What we're focused on is what's called alternatives analysis, and that's being worked on by Triangle Transit and by our consultants, URS. So what is alternatives analysis? Essentially, this is a year-long look at the various transit options that have been considered in our long-range transportation plan. The hope is that when we're finished with this study, that we will identify which projects might be most successful at the very beginning, and which projects might be most competitive for federal and state funding. So these next series of slides is an attempt to sort of define for you the actual study process. And the first step of that includes defining the study area. So you recall that I've talked a lot about these MPOs and their long-range transportation plan. Well, we extracted from the long-range transportation plan all the rail corridors within that plan. So what you see on the screen is essentially what looks like a curvy H. And in reality, and that H extends from Chapel Hill, UNC Hospital area into downtown Durham, through RTP, and then Morrisville, into Cary, down to Apex, and then continuing eastward onto downtown Raleigh, down to the Garner-Clayton border, and then up to Wake Forest. In total, this is 80 miles of rail corridor. And in a perfect world, we would love to build all of this at one time, but we can't afford that. And so part of this exercise is to identify which piece or parts of this should we build first. And so what we did is we divided this 80 miles of corridors into 18 different starting and ending points, or corridors. And we evaluated those corridors against each other to see which ones were the top performing corridors. So how do we evaluate it? Well, first let me show you an example of what one of the corridors looks like. For example, one corridor starts in the town of Wake Forest and heads south down, sort of paralleling US 1 into downtown Raleigh through the government center area, through NC State, and then terminating at the state fairgrounds. This is an example of what one of the corridors was. So we have our corridors, and how are we going to evaluate them? Well, we pulled together the following criteria, and they include socioeconomic, mobility, public input, land use, and finance. And I want to define those a little bit more for you. Socioeconomic is essentially looking at the population density and job density within a quarter or a half mile of the corridor itself. Want to look at the low-income family or households within the area, and density of minority households within the area. Mobility is pretty simple, is how many folks would actually ride the system, focusing specifically on the peak periods, so early morning and also late in the afternoon. Finance is obviously how much will it cost to build the system, not just to build it, but also to operate and maintain the system. Land use, if you're not familiar with that term, essentially it means we want to look at the infrastructure that exists along the corridor, both today and what is planned for the future. So for example, in our previous example of Wake Forest to the state fairgrounds, is this a case where we have a single family home every half mile, or is it are there a number of activity centers that we pass through, employment centers? Are there several groupings of 5 to 6 story office parks? These are the kinds of things we want to take into consideration as we're evaluating the corridor. And then last, but certainly not least, is the public input process. We've had to date over 12 public workshops in our first 2 phases. We hope to have another additional 6 workshops in the future. And also on our website, which you are currently on, which is ourtransitfuture.com. And all the information that is available in the workshops is also available on this website. So we have our corridors and we have our criteria, and we take them and we put them through this fancy computer model, and then we get some results. And so the next step is for you to give us your feedback about these results. This is where you come in. We want to hear your thoughts and interests about the corridors that have been selected and how they performed. One of the important things that we've done is we've identified 2 or 3 of the top performing corridors along this study, and we'd like to get your feedback and reaction to those top performers as well. The way that you can see the results is something similar to this. If you're familiar with Consumer Reports, we tried to model this after their reporting. And essentially, if you see a circle that's filled all the way in, it means it was a high performer. If a circle is halfway filled in, it was an average performer. And then if there's nothing in the circle, it was a low performer. There are detailed numbers behind each one of these circles. And so if you're the kind of person that would love to see the hard data, we have that available for you also on this website. But in an effort to kind of keep it give a simplistic look, this is the format we've decided to go with. So you will see this kind of markings on each one of the corridors. So now that we've identified sort of the top performing corridors, well, what happens next? Well, we actually go into more detailed analysis. And so these next series of slides is an attempt to graphically show you what we'll be looking at. And so, if you will, the blue stripe is the top performing corridor. And you remember that we have the evaluation criteria. So we want to go from point A to point B. And how are we going to do that? Well, it could go this way, which may be along the existing rail corridor. We may think about going outside of that corridor, or maybe even another direction altogether. And then you want to think about where the stations might be. And so as you perform more and more analysis, you realize that some of the options aren't that viable. And in the end, you've determined that this is in fact the best route or alignment to take. And once you've identified that, it then becomes the locally preferred alternative. And locally preferred alternative is a federal term. It's not one that you have to memorize, but essentially it means that this is the project. This is what the project will look like. This is the starting and ending point. This is the technology we're going to use, and this is the route we're going to take. So when we're done with the entire study, we hope to have identified 2 or 3 of these locally preferred alternatives or projects to then submit to the federal government for competition for federal funding. We hope to have one in Wake County, one that connects Wake and Durham County, and one that connects Durham and Orange County. When you think about the overall investment in transit and an overall vision for transit, it's important to know that buses will be the first thing that we will see in our area. Primarily because a bus is something that you can order within a year. You can hire a driver and you pick a route and then off you go. Rail, it just takes a little longer to build, and so it's these locally preferred alternatives that will be the first piece of rail that we might see in our area in the overall transit vision. If there was a corridor that you liked the most that didn't perform at the top, it doesn't mean that that corridor is a bad project. It just means that it's a candidate for a second or third phase in the overall vision for our community. So I've talked about a number of different processes. I know that can be confusing, so how does it all come together exactly? Well, you remember that there's the bus planning that's being led by our MPOs and by our counties, and then there's the alternatives analysis process which Triangle Transit is helping to lead. Well, when both of these processes and studies are completed, we will sit down together as MPO, Triangle Transit, and the County Commission to weigh the various options, bus versus rail, and run that through a financial model to see what we can actually afford. The result of that will be a transit plan for the Triangle that will be voted on by the County Commissions, the MPOs, and Triangle Transit. And then if the timing is right, the County Commissions might feel compelled to put a referendum on the ballot so that the people can decide if in fact this is the right plan for our area. The plan is obviously still in motion, but it's pretty safe to assume that it will likely consist of some form of improved bus service, both locally and regionally, some form of light rail service where the current and planned infrastructure can support this mode, and commuter rail, where we'll be connecting the longer distance commuters and connections within the region. And if we're lucky, this is what the vision will eventually look like. You recall sort of that curvy blue H of 80 miles of rail corridor, and you see some potential extensions off of that into other parts of the triangle. And most importantly, we have bus service spread throughout the triangle. But the important note is to remember this, is that we can't afford all of this at once, and so we have to figure out which piece of this and which part of this are we going to start with, and that's a big part of what this overall study is about. So as we close the presentation, I want to thank you again for taking time to see this presentation and to join us on this website. I hope that you found it informative. My hope is that you'll take time to look at the boards and look at the results and give us your feedback on this website. That would be so helpful in helping us structure what transit will look like for our future. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that you will continue to follow us on ourtransitfuture.com.